The bulk carrier OS35 arrived in Gibraltar waters mid-afternoon on the 29th of August 2022, loaded with steel cargo. At 9:30 that night, she requested permission to leave the bay, en route for the Netherlands. But 40 minutes later, the vessel clipped the Adam LNG. No one was injured, but Gibraltar woke up the following day to some very dramatic images. The Port Authority directed the OS35 to the east side in order to ensure it could be beached. Extensive salvage and containment operations initially centred on preventing the spread of fuel, although there was extensive damage to the beach and sea life in the region. The investigation into the collision was conducted in line with Gibraltar merchant shipping regulations. Its purpose is not to blame, nor to concern itself with civil or criminal liabilities. Its sole focus is to reduce the future risk of such incidents and to reduce their serious consequences. The report describes how the master of the OS35 was concerned that the tanker was drifting towards the anchored vessel Adam LNG because of tidal flow and wind, and that he set the engine to full ahead, which ultimately resulted in the collision. The report sets out its conclusions: that the master and bridge team did not monitor the manoeuvre effectively and had made an error in their understanding of the tidal flow and wind. That if the pilot had been on board the vessel, it's very likely that the collision would have been prevented. Pilotage is not compulsory for vessels leaving the Rock. However, Gibraltar pilots are now advised to provide clear information to masters on the availability from the Western Anchorage. The report also highlights that the master of the OS35 had initially told the Vessel Traffic Management and Information System, that's the VTS, that no contact had been made, when in fact a collision had taken place. The VTS officer didn't advise, as was usual practice, that OS35 should manoeuvre to the west from the Western Anchorage prior to heading south into the Gibraltar Strait. The report recommends the Port Authority should require VTS to provide clear advice to vessels prior to giving permission to depart from the Western Anchorage. But communication is two ways, and the investigation also identified that the VTS was not aware of the change of the OS35's intended manoeuvre until it was too late to prevent the collision, rendering their information ineffective. Nevertheless, the report says the response by VTS to ground the vessel following the collision was effective. It further commends the VTS for requiring the OS35 to wait in BGTW before directing the vessel to ground to the east of Gibraltar. The report also found that no drug and alcohol testing was subsequently carried out, either by the OS35 crew or the Royal Gibraltar Police, following the initial collision or grounding. It says the incident would benefit from a review to identify any improvements, including the requirement for drug and alcohol testing. Both vessels had valid verification certificates stating that their voyage data recorders were compliant with the required standard, but they weren't functioning. The report concludes that if the VDR had been fully functional on board the OS35 and the Adam LNG, the investigation would have been provided with a better understanding of the actions taken. The OS35 was ultimately removed from Gibraltar waters almost a year later, in July 2023. It's not a sight that anyone would want to see again.